They've never contemplated the possibility of facing any consequences for their actions. Now, after what they've done to Charlie, those consequences are finally upon them. There are other indicators, as you may have seen, that we are winning this fight. Last night, for example, the left-wing activist Jimmy Kimmel was finally taken off the air. Here's what Kimmel said, in case you missed it. Watch.
We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points from it.
Now, Kimmel was taken off the air just hours after the FCC chair, a man named Brendan Carr, gave an interview with Benny Johnson yesterday where he suggested that ABC, or more specifically ABC's affiliates, might be violating the terms of their broadcast licenses by airing Kimmel's show. Now, for background, it's been clear for many years that Kimmel was violating the terms of ABC's broadcast license. He was never performing any kind of comedy routine. He was simply delivering propaganda on behalf of the Democrat Party every single night, seemingly unconcerned with the fact that his ratings were plummeting year after year. In fact, on several occasions, he was caught working directly with Democrats in the Senate to distribute campaign materials. He celebrated the termination of conservatives, including Tucker Carlson. He celebrated when Donald Trump was banned from Twitter. He routinely embraced censorship and partisanship, and now he's finally gone, at least for the time being. Now, from a legal perspective, Kimmel's behavior was a problem because, as you may have noticed, not everybody gets the right to use the public airwaves in the way that ABC and their affiliates do. One of the requirements of holding a public broadcast license is that your content must advance the public interest in some way. Now, quoting from the FCC's website, in exchange for obtaining a valuable license to operate a broadcast station using the public airwaves, each radio and television licensee is required by law to operate its station in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Generally, this means it must air programming that is responsive to the needs and problems of its local community of license. Now, flagrant lies about major public events, which are distributed solely for the benefit of one political party, are clearly not in the public interest. In fact, there are specific federal rules against disseminating false information using the public airwaves about crimes or catastrophes. Now, let's put that up on the screen again. This is direct from the FCC's website. These are the rules. They've been the rules well established for decades. Just because they've never been enforced against these left-wing networks doesn't mean they didn't exist. So as you can see, broadcast licensees cannot broadcast false information concerning a crime or catastrophe if the licensee knows the information is false and it's foreseeable that the false information will cause substantial public harm. And then the false information does actually cause substantial public harm. Now, you could debate whether Kimmel's lie caused public harm under the strict legal definition, but in general, there's no doubt that flagrant falsehoods like this, falsehoods that effectively endorse political assassinations by running cover for them, are extremely damaging to the country in every meaningful way. And they certainly aren't in the public interest. Now, Kimmel knew that it wasn't true that Kirk's assassin was a Trump supporter. He knew that it made no sense to suggest that. He knew he was defaming a Christian husband and father who had just been murdered in front of his family and in front of the entire world, but he lied anyway, like the disgusting scumbag that he is. And he thought there would be no consequences for doing so because he's been lying for more than a decade in pretty much the same way. And indeed, normally, conservatives would hear smug degenerates like Kimmel say stuff like this, and they just shrug it off. Meanwhile, the left would destroy conservatives' livelihoods for infractions that weren't half as egregious. Conservatives wouldn't start a campaign to cancel Jimmy Kimmel's show. They certainly wouldn't call on the federal government to do anything. That was the state of play, right up until the moment that Charlie was murdered. And that is not the state of play anymore. First of all, immediately after Kimmel's comments, conservatives on X with large followings, including people like Aaron McIntyre at The Blaze, began telling their followers to bombard all of Kimmel's advertisers, as well as Disney and ABC executives, with complaints. And there was a massive response. Huge numbers of people were doing that. Then on top of that, here's what FCC Chair Brendan Carr said in an interview with Benny Johnson yesterday, quote, "We could do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct and take actions on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead." This is the approach that, along with activism by conservatives on social media, presumably sent ABC executives into a panic, along with the executives at Sinclair and Nexstar, which own the affiliates that broadcast ABC's content. But it's not actually clear that Brendan Carr was the tipping point here. There's evidence that these affiliates, especially after seeing the backlash, were simply tired of Kimmel's act, outraged by what he said, or probably more specifically, were worried about the audience backlash. In fact, Sinclair is now demanding that Kimmel apologize to Kirk's family and make a donation to Turning Point. Meanwhile, they're going to broadcast a tribute to Charlie Kirk in Kimmel's usual time slot. In other words, there's no reason to think that the government or the FCC had anything to do with Kimmel's suspension. The response from conservatives was probably enough. In any event, the upshot is that, at least for now, Kimmel won't be able to lie to his 15 viewers anymore or implicitly encourage them to commit political assassinations. And in response, the best defense that the left can offer isn't particularly convincing. Watch.
Let's back up and look at what Kimmel actually said on the program that has caused controversy. This is from Monday night in his Monday evening monologue. Kimmel suggested that the alleged killer of Charlie Kirk might have been a pro-Trump Republican. He said, quote, "The MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points from it." He said in between the finger pointing, there was grieving. Kimmel was expressing what we've heard some other liberals say in recent days, that the motives are unclear and that maybe the suspect in this case was a Republican or was some sort of far-right fringe figure. Of course, there has been a lot of discussion about that in recent days. There's a lot of evidence pointing in other directions about the suspect. But Kimmel was on the air talking about this, making a very serious commentary amid his jokes in his monologue Monday night.
Again, it's another lie. That's all they can do. First of all, Kimmel didn't suggest anything. He said it. He flat out said that the shooter was a MAGA Republican. And contrary to what Brian Stelter is saying, there's no basis at all for saying that the shooter might have been a Republican. Every single piece of evidence contradicts that claim, starting with the fact that he shot one of the most prominent Republicans in the entire country. And also he wrote that Charlie was a fascist on the bullets. He fell into left-wing politics, according to his own family. He had a gay, furry, transgender roommate. Okay, all of these things are evidence that that obviously he was not a Republican. Any attempt to suggest that this was a Republican shooter, including the claim that Stelter just made, is a grotesque lie. And it's a lie that does have legal implications, given that ABC relies on broadcast licenses. The people in charge can't fix a pothole, but they want you to trust them with your drinking water. Ask people in Flint, Michigan how that turned out. Lead, heavy metals, rust, basically liquid poison straight from the tap. That's why I suggest the Cove Pure water purifier to keep your family safe, because unlike the government, Cove Pure actually does its job. America's tap water is a cocktail of heavy metals and toxins, the fallout of corroded pipes that should have been replaced decades ago. Lead exposure, by the way, doesn't just make your water taste like you're chewing on a car battery. Causes brain damage, cancer, birth defects. But sure, trust the city council with your children's brains. What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, Cove Pure is the obvious fix. Their clear wave technology removes up to 99.9% of contaminants, lead, PFAs, pharmaceuticals, you name it. No plumbers, no drilling. Just plug it in on the countertop, set the temperature you want with the touchscreen, and it actually tastes like water. Imagine that. So don't wait around for the government to solve this. They won't. So go to covepure.com/Walsh right now. Get $200 off while supplies last. Take back control of your family's health and finally drink water the way it was meant to be. But the lies kept coming on CNN. Here's what Van Jones had to say.
That is why we exist. Not to knuckle under, not to do what we're told, but to stand up and to say, listen, if you want to pull these licenses, then we're going to go to court. And we'll be in the court of public opinion. But you don't get to go on a podcast and set policy for American media, for an American media institution that's been around a lot longer than me, you, or Donald Trump. This is a red line that has been crossed for our industry, for the First Amendment, for the right of people to speak. There was nothing hateful about what was said, and even hateful speech is protected. This is not acceptable. If you are going to run a media organization, it's called a news organization, you have to stand up to government bullying anywhere in the world, and certainly in the United States.
Well, the job should be to, speak truth to power, even when there are people who don't like the word truth anymore.
Well, he's wrong, by the way, that the speech wasn't hateful. I mean, it clearly was. It was very obviously an attempt to malign Charlie Kirk's movement and every one of his supporters. But that's not the biggest problem with what Van Jones said. He's acting as though the FCC has just violated the First Amendment simply because the FCC chair mentioned on a podcast that they were considering the possibility of, taking a look at this and seeing if there was lawful action to take against ABC and its affiliates. mean, that's the most that was done at the governmental level, was talking about something on a podcast. But of course, in his answer, Jones doesn't say a word about broadcast licenses or ABC's obligations under the law. He doesn't acknowledge the very significant distinction between an organization like CNN, which is a cable network, and a network like ABC, which is broadcast over public airwaves. Nor does he address the statement from Sinclair, which was obviously appalled by what Kimmel had said, all on their own. Nexstar had a similar statement. But even if we assume the FCC was the deciding factor, even though it probably wasn't, the key point is that Jimmy Kimmel and these ABC affiliates do not have a constitutional right to use the public airwaves to disseminate malicious propaganda on behalf of a political party. I'm sorry, but they just don't. The use of those airwaves is a privilege, and there's a mountain of evidence, up to and including Kimmel's statements about Charlie Kirk, that ABC does not deserve to have that privilege. I know we're so used to the fact that networks like ABC have been able to use the public airwaves and maintain their broadcast licenses, while every single day for years and years and years, violating the rules of the license and disseminating propaganda, lying to their audiences. Like, we're used to that. But that doesn't mean that it was ever actually legal to do. And there are a lot of things that up until this moment, conservatives have just said, okay, yeah, well, probably, they shouldn't be doing that. Really, they aren't supposed to do it. They can't do it. But they're doing it anyway. And, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Take their license away? That was kind of the conservative attitude up until this moment. And now the attitude is, well, yeah, we'll take their license away. Why shouldn't we? You violated the rules. We're going to hold you to it. What argument do you have besides crying about it? Go ahead and cry. We don't care. In fact, we revel in your tears. We revel in them. Now, admittedly, at this point, we are in unfamiliar territory as conservatives. We're not used to the idea of utilizing the power of the federal government in a way that that inflicts any kind of meaningful consequences on our political opponents, or even that suggests consequences might be possible in order to improve this country and restore civil liberties to all Americans. We've seen how Democrats use the power of the federal government maliciously and unlawfully. And so we have a natural aversion to the idea of doing anything that may appear remotely similar. But not all federal crackdowns amount to lawfare. Not every aggressive action by the DOJ or the FCC is unconstitutional. We actually don't have an obligation to pretend that every Soros-funded nonprofit is untouchable, or that every corporate media outlet deserves to have a broadcast license. We can believe in the First Amendment while also punishing unlawful conduct that's masquerading as legitimate. Every conservative must understand this. As long as we are very judicious about how we proceed, as long as we don't devolve into a Fannie Willis-style circus or go around policing hate speech, then we have the opportunity to bring about some of the most significant improvements to American civic life in generations. We can prevent rioters from terrorizing entire cities because BLM has selected a new martyr, or because ICE officers are arresting illegal aliens in a particular city. We can shut down militant trans NGOs, preventing young people from receiving money to mutilate their bodies or commit acts of terrorism. We can end the practice of strangely well-funded and well-equipped protesters popping up at a moment's notice to harass law enforcement or witnesses in federal trials or shut down traffic on the highway. We can and should do all of those things. The job of the federal government is to ensure that every citizen in this country can enjoy their civil liberties. And a big part of that responsibility is to ensure that criminal enterprises are not operating within our borders, plotting acts of terrorism that will silence conservative expression. Again, the president seems to understand that. Last night, for example, he declared that Antifa is a major domestic terrorist organization. And while the left will complain about that designation, no reasonable person can really dispute it. Everyone can see now that the left supports political assassinations. They openly endorse political violence without any reservation. They revel in it. And there's strong evidence that some of the most powerful groups on the left are funding this violence. These criminals have operated with impunity for far too long. Like Jimmy Kimmel, they've never contemplated the possibility of facing any consequences for their actions. Never contemplated the idea that any rule would ever be enforced against them. Now, after what they've done to Charlie, those consequences, which will be as ruthless as they are righteous, are finally upon them. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.